Hey everybody, this is Luke and it is Serious Sunday. How are you enjoying your weekend so far? Hope that it's doing really well. Are you playing games? I know that I have been. I've been recently spending a little bit of time catching back up on my Dark Souls recently. It's been quite a while. I only actually ever really played the first one, but Dark Souls 3 just came out very recently and I figure I kind of got to catch up because it's been a while. Unfortunately, I didn't have an opportunity to play Bloodborne, sadly, but that's because I don't own a PlayStation or really any consoles at the moment. I used to, but I was living in Japan at the time of the big earthquake, the Tohoku Daishinsai that they had, and my Xbox red ringed during that, and surprisingly my Wii survived, so what are you going to do there? Anyway, back to, on the topic. So, having played a little bit of Dark Souls recently, I began to think a little bit more about difficult games, or kind of games that are hard, but benefit from being overly difficult. This is sort of something that I had been thinking about a little bit, and almost ended up being the topic of my most recent Thursdev when I was talking about modding. Because at one point, when I originally got into it, I started my modding chat recently thinking about how some of these Mario Maker levels are just ridiculously difficult, and that is something that I touched on sort of in the middle of it. But at the end of the day, my thesis sort of evolved from, people are making these ridiculously difficult levels, and if you guys really want us to kind of get into the design thing, you should probably think about making something a little bit more balanced, or sort of considering how to make a good level or a fun level as opposed to just something that's overly difficult and requires a ridiculous amount of skill to finish. But instead of taking the whole your designs are bad and you should feel bad kind of angle, because I figure that's kind of a dick move, and to be honest, these levels do have merit, as I mentioned in my Thursday video. Instead, I thought that it might be worth sort of looking at when hard design is good, or when games sort of benefit from it. So once again, Dark Souls is probably the game that I'm going to be talking about the most here. Of course, predated by Demon Souls. Now there's a third game that just came out a couple weeks ago. But these games always rate amazingly high, and it's not just because of the way that the game is presented. It is a fantastic and beautiful series of games, of course, but also their methods of storytelling, which are something else that I would love to get into at some point, because they do something that is very risky, but at the same time has paid off immensely well for them. But that is a topic for another day. More to the point, Dark Souls and, the Souls series, I guess, because of Demon Souls previous to it, and difficulty. So there's this, for a long time, I think actually before Demon Souls even came out, there was this very heavy trend in game development towards games that were reasonably challenging, or had at least a challenge that was worth sort of considering, but at the same time weren't overly difficult. Like, when Demon Souls came out, there was all this talk about hand-holding in video games. Hand-holding being where the game pretends to challenge you, but at the same time never really throws something at you that the player shouldn't be able to handle, because there was a sort of design philosophy going on around the time where the thought was that if you are making something too difficult, if you are pushing your player away because you're not letting them finish the game, you're not giving them the opportunity to play all the way through to the end, then players are going to churn and they're going to become less interested. And what you really want at the end of the day as a game developer, and this stands true to this day, is for people to start playing your game, play through the middle part, and make it all the way to the end. Unfortunately, for most video games, especially in a saturated market like we have right now, a lot of games don't get played to completion. That's just it's a fact of life, really. But that said, you have these games that were coming out around the time that was like, some games will be frustrating, some games will be difficult, But very rarely do you run into a game that was just genuinely hard. Not hard in like the sense of much older games like the Nintendo era and things like that. We recently on Wednesday played Zombies Ate My Neighbors, which is another good example of a game that was punishingly difficult. Actually, punishing is not a great term because it's actually something that we should probably be striving to sort of separate as far as terms go between games that are hard, games that are difficult, games that are punishing, you know? Because what punishing really kind of comes down to is it challenges you as a player. It makes the game difficult. It makes the game very hard for you as a person who is still sort of learning the game and is still fallible. And when you make a mistake, when you do something badly, it punishes you. That's kind of by definition what punishing gameplay means. It is unforgiving. It just beats you down if you don't do something right. And there are a lot of games that fit that mold. I'm not going to say that they're not. Dark Souls, in its own way, is fairly punishing at times, but at the same time, there is a way that they manage to balance this out that I'd like to talk a little bit about. But and you have that games that are just like genuinely difficult, but not necessarily punishing. A great example of that would be like Super Meat Boy. Actually, Super Meat Boy is one of the least punishing games possible as far as I'm concerned, because you can die and you're back like that. You're immediately back into the game. By eliminating this sort of a time for introspection. Basically, when you die, their immediate respawn and go back to it, get right back into this level and keep on trying. Sort of way that they designed the game was, whether intentional or not, genius. Great design, great way to do it. Played another game very recently called Chiku, which you'll be seeing tomorrow as of this particular recording, which does the exact same thing. You can die, and you do die all the damn time, but you come back to life immediately. And that's a great way to make a challenging game or an overly difficult game, or even in some cases an unfair game, still enjoyable and still completely playable. On the other side of that spectrum are games like Dark Souls, where you have a problem of this game is so skill-based. It relies so much on the player not only learning the way that the game is meant to be played, but adhering to those rules. Dark Souls, I mean, you can do things in Dark Souls that will get you around certain problems in the game, certain difficulties. But at the same time, you are always sort of beholden to the way that the game requires you to play it. If you get into a straight up fight, you just can't brute force your way through this game the way that you could in a number of other games. At the same time, you have games... Dark Souls, if you get into combat, you have to be paying attention to your enemies. You can't just keep on wailing on them, because that really doesn't work. You have to understand the way that their combat works, and that you are on sort of equal footing with even sort of the weakest of your enemies. Not completely equal footing, but that said, it's much less of a power fantasy as they go. And that's interesting, because a lot of video games up until that point, or up until the point of sort of Demon's Souls, were straying away from that sort of a gameplay, because they wanted to make sure that the player had that power fantasy, had the feeling that they were always in control and that they could beat it as long as they kept at it. But I think sort of because of that, or sort of as a byproduct of that, there were a lot of players who felt as though they were no longer being challenged, or no longer having the need to invest a lot of themselves into a video game, because as long as you sort of go through the paces, as long as you keep on playing the game from the beginning to the end, you'll make it to the end without a whole lot of additional difficulty. You can play a lot of these games start to finish without even completely dying, right? There's Dark Souls. I recall personally, even very early on in the game, they throw you right at the Asylum Demon at the very beginning, right? And that thing will just beat the living shit out of you if you are not immediately starting to fight smart. And they do some cool things with it as well, by teaching you that you can do massive amounts of damage if you jump down onto enemies from above. Use the environment to your advantage. There's no such thing as a cheap shot in this game. Take the victories where you can get them. That sort of a thing, right? But it sort of enforces this kind of a rule set. And I think there were a lot of players that were wanting this kind of a difficulty level. And that was something, again, that I touched on in the most recent Thursday video, that players, through the, lovely, what's the word here? Through the advent of mods, were able to make more difficult games, were able to make their games more difficult, and therefore for them more enjoyable by doing things like difficulty mods, like rebalancing mods, and also interesting things like adding new rule sets to the game. So, yeah. It was something that obviously there was a niche that wanted, and so we have From Software and Bandai Namco pairing together to make this series of games that is now famous for being just difficult, being very hard to win, and yet at the same time, like, despite the fact that those ones are particularly well known and particularly well liked. And I'm going to be the first to say, in this case, before anybody corrects me on it, that yes, there is a whole lot more going for the game than just the fact that it is a hard game, but is fair because anytime you die, it is kind of your own fault. It has an amazing narrative and stuff like that. If you pay attention, if you care enough about the lore of Dark Souls, is very, very deep. But again, that's something for another day. But there is a market for these kinds of difficult games, and I'd be interested in seeing if some more people kind of pile onto this, because as it goes, From Software kind of is monopolizing the difficult game market as it goes. I mean, like, fair difficult games. There are unfair, there are very difficult games, and there are games that sort of don't have the same sort of gentlemanly difficulty, if that makes any sort of sense. They don't, they aren't difficult in an assholic kind of way, which I'm very hard on games like I Want to Be the Guy, I Want to Be the Bossy, and like, what is it, Adventure Kid or something like that, I think is another name, and another one of those kinds of games where it's just like cheap laughs or sort of cheap wins by the designer because they're just like, oh, you didn't know about this, so you die. I hate to sort of have this amount of disdain in my voice when I'm talking about fellow game designers, but I don't see the draw. I think that's bad game design. I could talk about that for a long time, but I won't get too far into it. Suffice it to say, my thoughts on game difficulty as they should go, or game difficulty as is most properly implemented, is through the creation of a very solid set of rules, which is something that I think that Dark Souls and games of its ilk did extremely well. Whereas games that are basically just memorization and knowing how to, or just like sort of pattern creation are just, it's not the type of fun that leads to something being a memorable, a positively memorable experience. I died all the time in Dark Souls when I played it. It took me a long time to learn to dodge and to learn to block and to learn how to do counterattacks and things like that. But by learning to do these things, I became much more powerful, and I felt much more powerful playing these games. Whereas these ones, you don't feel powerful. You don't feel like you're accomplishing very much aside from, hey, I finally beat that level, thank God. Now I have another challenge that I have to deal with. You became excited playing a game of Dark Souls. You became excited to see what was coming up next. You became excited to find a brand new piece of equipment that was something either in a set that you were looking for or that was just better than what you currently had. I was actively seeking out Titanite so that I could reforge my weapons so that I could become more powerful. And I was seeking out these large and scary and difficult monsters and figuring out the way that they fought and figuring out how I could fight them to do well. And big props to Hidetaka Miyazaki, who is the creator of the Dark Souls, also the person who is the president of game development of From Software. So good on you, Miyazaki-san. You did a great job with the Dark Souls series. And I hope that other people kind of follow in his footsteps and continue to make hard games like those. Hard but fair, hard but smart. So that's my completely random and probably useless sort of thoughts today on difficult games or games that are hard but fair. So I hope that this made some kind of sense. It's 4 a.m. right now. So, yeah. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Don't make it too serious. Have a good one. Play some games. We'll see you guys tomorrow for a new game. Take care.